The Christian legacy in America has historically manifested in attempts to usurp the very freedoms of which they ironically claim credit. Freedoms that didn't exist throughout the vast majority of Christian history. That's especially disconcerting during this day and age, when people seem to think that the answer to Islam is Christianity, when in actuality Christianity and Islam have shared some disturbing similarities, both being ancient Middle Eastern Abrahamic religions with long histories of authoritarianism, censorship, and brutality. While their DNA is identical, the main reason Christianity manifests differently today is because it has been declawed by a few hundred years of secularism. This should tell us that the answer to Islam is not more religion, but less. Too many people mistakenly believe that religion stabilizes society. In fact, it has been our Christian leaders in the West who talk tough on terrorism, only to then prop up and arm Islamic theocratic regimes in the Middle East and Asia, which have destabilized their regions, thereby causing refugees and migrants to flee their highly religious countries into the stability and safety of secular countries. We will never solve this problem if we keep giving the problem credit for being the solution. Religion is not the answer. That is why I feel I must set the record straight when a recent wave of populist voices have been duped into presenting Christianity as the solution to geopolitical and social problems, because they think it's the foundation of our culture, and that even atheists like myself are cultural Christians. I say it's the exact opposite. Christians are typically cultural secularists, all the way to the point that even their most sacred holy days are now homages to capitalism. And that's fine by this old atheist, but that leaves Jesus with far too many tables to overturn. So let's not overstate Christianity's true role in this ever-changing world of ours. To frame my point, I'm going to respond to David Wood's defibrillator argument for God. The reason I chose David is because his approach exemplifies what Christianity has done throughout history. From the current idea of what we call Western values to science itself, Christianity loves to take all the credit. But when you delve into the actual history, you find that at best, Christianity played only a part, and at worst, it was active opposition. In this case, David gives Christianity the credit for science, decrying what he calls atheist teenagers on Twitter who think they're champions of science. I think that's posturing, however, because I suspect David would not trouble himself with such a response to mere teenagers on Twitter. The more probable reason for his argument, I believe, is that modern scientists are typically atheists, and since scientists are the foremost experts on the mechanics of our universe, with far more information than their illustrious predecessors, it's very telling that most of them are not religious. David falls all the way back to the Copernican scientific revolution, beginning during the mid-16th century. This was the scientific revolution that birthed modern science and led to the Enlightenment, so it's quite a valuable thing indeed of which to claim ownership. He does this with the beginning of his defibrillator argument. Premise 1, no hypothesis in history has more scientific confirmation than theism. Premise 2, no hypothesis in history has more scientific disconfirmation than atheism. Conclusion, if we have respect for science, we must accept theism and reject atheism. Notice that if we replace the words theism and atheism with their actual definitions, the premises fail to support the conclusion, for they'd be statements of confirmation of belief and disconfirmation of disbelief, and belief or disbelief have no bearing on the actual truth. So he's using the words improperly. What he means to say is that science confirms the existence of God. The reason he thinks God has so much scientific confirmation is because he believes that everything we've ever learned from every scientific experiment ever conducted constitutes evidence for God. He does this by crediting Christianity with ownership of the very basis of science, as he describes thusly: 1. The universe can be understood. 2. We can understand it. And 3. It is good. to understand it. Since the scientific endeavor is predicated on these beliefs, every single scientific finding, no matter what it is evidence for God, according to David. This is because David thinks that not until Christianity did people believe that the universe could be understood, that we could understand it, or that it was good to understand it. Notice, however, that David is once again using imprecise language. Since the universe is literally everything, all this means is that learning is possible, we can learn, and it is good to learn. Given that, human beings have always believed this and done this, or we'd be extinct. So I think what David is actually referring to is the way we look to the natural world as a reference point to systematically gain knowledge. Unfortunately for David, this was common practice in ancient Greece, hundreds of years before Christianity. David actually vaguely mentions that there were some scientific advancements in ancient Greece, but glosses over that because there was never a scientific revolution there. As you'll see, that was his biggest mistake in making this argument. Greece fell, Rome fell, and their knowledge was suppressed by Christian tyranny only to resurface and become a vital part of the very same scientific revolution David credits Christianity for causing. You'll see once again that it was Christianity that fought tooth and nail against something that caused greatness, only for Christianity to take all the credit once the greatness was realized. Historically, this has been Christianity's typical MO. Fight a war against progress, lose that war against progress, and when that progress turns out to be a good thing after all, claim credit for that progress. David makes his case for Christianity being the cause of the scientific revolution by pointing out that all of the scientists at that time were Christians, and to find out why they devoted their lives to understanding the universe, he provides various quotes from those scientists. This is a very flawed way to present the argument. To truly understand why the scientific revolution happened, it requires an extensive study of much more than the scientists themselves, but rather what was going on in that region politically, socially, philosophically, technologically, and yes, religiously. So let's save the scientists for the end and dig into what actually caused the scientific revolution in the first place. Why were Christians the pioneers of the scientific revolution? David is more than happy to answer for we atheists by saying, atheists often insist that it was just dumb luck. Anyone could have done it, and if Europe had been filled with atheists, it would have happened even faster. As you will see, however, luck more aptly describes David's explanation. He goes on to note that there were cultures and civilizations around the world that had the opportunity to study astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology, but these branches of science all took off at roughly the same time in one particular civilization. When we investigate why this is so, David says, what we find is people who believe that the universe is intelligible because of their theistic beliefs, that they're rational because God is rational, and they were made in the image of God. So, by setting out to understand it, they're worshiping God. Bam! Christianity gets the credit for science. Case closed, right? Not so fast. Let's take off our God goggles and look at what actually happened. First, let's clear atheists of the incompetence David implies. He boasts about how it was Christians, not atheists, who began the scientific revolution. David's argument is a classic supremacist argument. One of the reasons supremacist arguments are so bad is that they usually don't account for oppression as a variable. He's boasting about the accomplishments of his group, the oppressor, over the lack of accomplishments of the oppressed group, the atheists, who would have been burned at the stake back then. This is adding insult to injury. Of course, his group accomplished more than the groups they were oppressing. What else would we expect? Now that the variable of oppression has been affected, however, and the playing field is more even, can we still say that is so? No. Of course not. If we look at our top scientists now, they're mostly atheists. That's true even in the United States, where atheists are still a tiny minority. Let that sink in. As soon as you're no longer allowed to kill this tiny minority, suddenly that same tiny minority becomes the majority of your top minds. Very telling, isn't it? Maybe theists should have tried listening to us rather than killing us and censoring us. David's argument doesn't even make sense from a logical standpoint. The scientific revolution happened suddenly and proceeded very quickly. As the influential historian, physicist, and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn pointed out, scientific progress is based on paradigm shifts, which is what causes scientific revolutions in the first place. During the Copernican scientific revolution, however, Christianity was already a 1,500-year-old established norm. When a paradigm shift occurs, we simply do not look to a 1,500-year-old cultural norm as the cause, as the question quickly arises, why did this widespread, brutally enforced, ancient cultural norm called Christianity fail to produce anything like a scientific revolution for 1,500 years, the first full 75% of its entire existence, only to then spontaneously, simultaneously inspire a bunch of scientists to trigger the scientific revolution? No, I couldn't find any historian who believes that. David's explanation is more luck-based than anything history has to tell us. To find the real answer, we need to look at what changed, not at what stayed the same. As it just so happens, that era was filled with change. After Rome fell, ancient Greek philosophy, science, literature, and politics, which heavily influence Western culture today, were largely lost. This knowledge was discovered by the Arabs, who translated and preserved the knowledge in Arabic. It's no coincidence that many Muslims claim Islam is responsible for the creation of science, just as David claims Christianity is responsible. Guess why? While the Islamic world did produce some scientific advancements during its golden age, that came to an end as Mongols invaded around the exact same time ancient Greek knowledge was finally rediscovered by Europeans, who translated it from Arabic to Latin and introduced it to Europe during the 12th century, which, as any historian will tell you, was the reason for a major turning point in history. This was something new to them, something different, something we can look to as a reason for a paradigm shift, precisely what is necessary for a scientific revolution. The recovery of ancient Greek philosophy culminated during the 13th century, coinciding perfectly with the Renaissance and subsequent scientific revolution, a much more narrow timeline than the 1,500 years Christianity had to allegedly inspire this sudden change. On the contrary, rather than inspire the scientific revolution, Christianity delayed it. Aristotle had views that were deemed incompatible with Christian belief. He did not believe in divine intervention but determinism. He also believed not in divine revelation, but rather that knowledge could only be gained through direct observation and reasoning. That sounds a lot like science, doesn't it? Heretics during the 12th century were put to death, so the Church certainly didn't approve of teaching unaltered Aristotelian philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, most notably, recognized value in Aristotle and worked to reconcile Aristotle's work with Christian theology, modifying what he could, and eventually helped convince the Church that they were compatible. After that, Greek philosophy was allowed to be taught at universities and became standard. This did not happen as quickly as it would today. Reading material back then was very time-consuming and expensive to create. As we trace back the roots of what we call Western civilization today, however, we would be remiss to claim that we only took the good and left the bad. Unfortunately, Aristotle used his ideas about natural law to justify slavery, and Thomas Aquinas found validity in those ideas, preserving them in the Christian tradition, which wasn't difficult to do with tacit approval in the form of rules for the practice coming from both the Old and New Testaments. Approval of slavery eventually became a blight on the rise of America. So while many American values, including the structure of our government, were inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, for the betterment of society, we absolutely had to have the will to override some of those values, like the approval of slavery. Let us also not forget that the ancient Greeks and Romans persecuted atheists as well. Not that anyone from their era was quick to volunteer their thoughts about the non-existence of deities. No, the charge of atheism was more commonly used as an accusation to rid oneself of their enemies. The ultimate irony is that early Christians were killed under the charge of atheism for rejecting the existence and power of the state-sponsored gods of Rome, which is another unfortunate disease that carried over into Christianity, the persecution of atheists and the toxic mingling of government and religion, a thing the founding fathers of America were at least wise enough to reject from the very beginning, thereby working against nearly half of the Ten Commandments. The most unique and foremost of our values, those that protect our freedom of speech, religion, press, and assembly, are absent throughout the vast majority of a Christian history that often enforced the very opposite of our values as Americans. So, a couple hundred years before the scientific revolution, we have ancient Greek knowledge being widely disseminated into the universities. While universities did evolve from theological studies, their utility wasn't realized by the secular world until the recovery of Greek philosophy, and not until that secular utilitarianism did we start to see rapid progress. It's important to note that there have been geniuses all throughout history within Christianity and beyond. So why could none of them accomplish what the geniuses of the scientific revolution did? Notice that a component of science has still been missing from history up until this point, a component that David did not mention at all: the widespread cooperation and eventual peer review of other scientists. While the term peer review didn't exist until the 20th century, its vital precursor goes back to the exact era of the scientific revolution. Before people could easily study each other's work, geniuses were often separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles. So did something happen during that time and place to solve that problem? Yes, the printing press was invented in Europe during the 15th century. After that, books and other mass publications, including new scientific discoveries, weren't so expensive and time-consuming to translate, create, and disseminate. That facilitated a vast network of geniuses working together, all studying and building off of each other's work relatively quickly like never before. It was like the old world's internet. David totally ignores this crucial factor and instead argues that no, it was a widely established ancient cultural norm that did something it had never done before by suddenly simultaneously causing scientists who just so happened to live in the same time and place where the printing press was invented to spark the scientific revolution. Again, David's argument is the one that's based on luck, not mine. It's true that the initial viability of the printing press was due to the demand for Bibles, as such a thing would be in high demand during the brutal reign of the Church, but that's a mere credit of logistics, and not a matter of credit for anything philosophical or scientific. Furthermore, this was a period when explorers were leaving Europe on voyages all over the world for the first time, leading to many discoveries of other cultures and ideas. And when they returned to Europe, they brought knowledge of those cultures and ideas with them. David seems to think that Europe existed in a vacuum during the 15th and 16th centuries, but that is very much not the case. He ironically blames the rest of the world for being ignorant, when in actuality the rest of the world's ideas were converging in Europe at that time and inspiring people in new ways, including contemporary Greek scientists, scholars, artists, and philosophers who were fleeing into Europe as refugees after the Ottoman invasion of Constantinople. Many historians believe this also played an important role in the rise of Renaissance humanism. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to emphasize the importance of ancient Greek influence. As it just so happens, history provides us with a brilliant visual representation of the Greek influence on thought during that time, despite the brutal hold Christianity held upon people back then. Art and science have always had a special relationship, borrowing from each other and inspiring each other. Just before the scientific revolution, which marked a huge shift in science, there was the Renaissance, which marked a huge shift in art. Again, this was no coincidence. So what inspired this sudden shift in art? The rediscovery of ancient Greek civilization, of course. Why is this significant? Because the art of ancient Greece and Rome was actually far more advanced than medieval art, which came many hundreds of years later. We people of modernity aren't accustomed to the past being more advanced than the future, but in many aspects of Christianity's brutal reign, that was exactly the case. When you look at ancient Greek art, a tradition that was carried on in ancient Rome as well, you see art that was created using methodology that David falsely accredits to Christianity. This is why Christian medieval art was not realistic, but Greek and Roman art was, because not only did the Greeks value the natural world, but they knew how to reference it. That was hundreds of years before Christianity, so Christianity cannot be credited with that way of thinking. David's argument was defeated around 2,500 years before he ever uttered it. Look at the artwork the Christian world was producing during the medieval period, from the 5th century, not long after Christianity gained dominance, to the 15th century, the century that marks the beginning of the cracks in its foundation. What we have here is 1,000 years of slowed progress, a period during the height of Christian power and influence when scientific, philosophical, technological, and artistic advancements were relatively few and far between. They did occur, of course, and we have religion to thank for preserving literacy during that time, but it wasn't anything like the rapidly improving world following that period, spurred on during the Renaissance after the rediscovery of ancient Greece. Look at the artwork. Look at where our minds were. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, the Christians were not looking to the natural world for reference, as David claims. They were looking inward to their flawed imaginations. They were obsessed with fantasy realms like heaven and hell, and they ignored the natural world. This is clearly reflected in the primitive, childish, two-dimensional, badly proportioned artwork that followed the far more advanced artwork of ancient Greece and Rome, fallen and swept into the dustbin of history. Christian authoritarianism resulted in the censorship and desecration of Greek and Roman statues. They destroyed history because it was contrary to Scripture and their sensitivities, thus prohibiting progress. When Christianity has unchecked power over government, the results are always Orwellian. When does this period of ignorance end? Not until the Renaissance do you see a lot of history finally picking up where it left off 1,000 years beforehand. The visual cue of this manifests in the adoption of Greco-Roman artistic methodology. You can clearly see the change in the artwork, which was quickly followed by the change in the science. Not a coincidence. This was the birth of the Renaissance humanists, when people started looking at the natural world again for reference, causing a resurgence of realism. David thanks Christianity for this shift in thought, but it's evident that Christianity inspired the exact opposite. For over 1,000 years, inspired people to look to the spiritual world, a make-believe world, for knowledge, which is precisely why we did not advance like we did until we gained from classical antiquity a renewed appreciation for the natural world, the real world, not the spiritual world. And that is what finally ushered in real progress. Think about all that damage religion has done to our basic progress. The next time you want to ask atheists why they talk about God so much, Sure, much of the artwork back then was biblically based, but that was the sanctioned story of the time, and the church was the main entity with the money to commission such work. So that's again a matter of logistics or even indoctrination. We saw the same subject matter during the medieval period, but clearly their techniques, their very way of thinking, changed. And that was definitely not thanks to Christianity, because for 1,500 years, Christianity had its chance. But what about what the scientists of that time actually said? Those damning quotes professing God to be the reason for their inspiration. It would be quite a shocking historical incongruity if they were anything other than Christian. Consider the context of that period. This was the beginning of modern scientific knowledge, before they had very many answers. As I said, after we gained a respectable amount of answers, scientists naturally shifted to atheism. That's because the answers didn't point to God the way everyone thought they would. 16th century scientists lived hundreds of years before Darwin, before there was a significantly exhaustive, most highly confirmed theory in science that explains in great detail exactly how human beings came to exist. Before that, we didn't know, and the deliberate design of our bodies seemed perfectly plausible. Putting all that aside, those scientists lived during a time when heretics were put to death. Because of their discoveries, as history shows, those scientists walked on a razor's edge between Christian approval and heretical thought, the latter of which caused some of the very same scientists David boasts as devout Christians to be persecuted and censored by the church for wrongthink, as their scientific findings were deemed incompatible with Christian doctrine, no doubt retarding scientific progress. So yes, without Christians at the helm, there are very good reasons to believe it would have happened much faster. So what damning quotes did David provide us with from those scientists of hundreds of years ago? Those who study the stars have God for a teacher. Tycho Brahe. Brahe was a Danish nobleman. Our piety is the deeper, the greater is our awareness of creation and its grandeur. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it befits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather, above all else, of the glory of God. Johannes Kepler. Kepler was the imperial mathematician to Rudolf II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his grandfather was Lord Mayor of Wilderstadt. I see plainly that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends uniquely on my awareness of the true God, to such an extent that I was incapable of perfect knowledge about anything else until I became aware of him. René Descartes. Descartes' father was a member of Parliament. There are two kinds of people one can call reasonable: those who serve God with all their heart because they know him, and those who seek him with all their heart because they do not know him. Blaise Pascal. Pascal's father was a judge and a member of the nobles of the robe. The vastness, beauty, and orderliness of heavenly bodies, the excellent structure of animals and plants, and other phenomena of nature justly induce an intelligent, unprejudiced observer to conclude a supreme, powerful, just, and good author. Robert Boyle. Boyle's father was the first Earl of Cork. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind that it has never had many professors. Isaac Newton. I actually have something to say about the content of this quote because of its incredible hypocrisy. Isaac Newton, you see, was secretly against the Trinity, yet dared not make his views public. His private writings on the matter safely discovered long after his death. Of course, he knew the limitations the orthodox Christian view imposed upon his speech. He, of all people, knew that it would have been suicide to openly profess atheism in most cultures, yet he attributes the lack of atheist professors to the senselessness and odiousness of atheism? No. Newton obsessed over alchemy and the Bible, and ironically, if he had limited his studies to such, we wouldn't even know his name today. To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more gratifying than knowledge. Nicholas Copernicus. If it is the case that God finds knowledge more gratifying than ignorance, then it forces one to wonder why he plagued all of humankind with death, just because the first people ate from the tree of knowledge. Nicholas Copernicus, son of a wealthy merchant, was the guy at the very beginning of the scientific revolution. I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. When I reflect on so many profoundly marvelous things that persons have grasped, sought, and done, I recognize even more clearly that human intelligence is a work of God, and one of the most excellent. Galileo Galilei. Unlike the limited knowledge available to Galileo during the 17th century, we people of the 21st century are privileged to understand quite well how human intelligence evolved naturally. Notice that throughout these quotes, I've included the connections these illustrious scientists had with the aristocracy. This is important to note because there were many peasant uprisings going on all over Europe at that time, making the upper class very nervous. The aristocracy supported a more authoritarian church in order to help keep the peasants in check. These scientists were caught between a rock and a hard place. Not only did they have to worry about the peasant uprisings, but they had to worry about persecution from the church because of their scientific findings being deemed heretical. Of course, I'm not saying they were secret atheists, but they had everything to lose and nothing to gain by deviating from the norm and failing to declare that their work was in devotion to God. In other words, they had no choice but to profusely pander to the church, especially if they wanted to continue their research unmolested. Those scientists definitely did not have the leeway to deviate, to allow their scientific findings to cast any sort of doubt, at least not publicly. And that is hardly something about which David should be boasting from the comfort of a country that values freedom of religion, one of our most important values, a value that was violently opposed by Christianity all throughout its history, and certainly opposed by the Bible itself. Note that Galileo, the father of modern science, was censored by the church and held captive under permanent house arrest and threatened with execution for the charge of, and I quote, following the position of Copernicus, which is thought crime. Rest assured that the church finally apologized to Galileo when I was in high school in 1992, 359 years after condemning him. Better late than never. But how could Copernicus be so damned? He was the guy at the very beginning of this revolution. David claimed him as a devout Christian, vital to modern science. So how could it possibly be a crime, punishable with lifelong incarceration and possibly even death, to merely follow the position of Copernicus? David proclaimed that Copernicus's reasons for doing his scientific studies involved his desires to know and comprehend the works of God, and that he believed those studies to be a form of worship. That doesn't sound like a guy the church should be suppressing. David said, and I quote, sounds like his scientific research was grounded in his religious beliefs. Wrong. The motive for his research may have been grounded in his religious beliefs, if you believe he wasn't pandering to the church for his very life, but his actual research was grounded in scientific methodology, which is completely absent from Scripture, and the objectivity of that methodology is utterly immune to anyone's motives. You can use the scientific method to create a nuclear bomb, for instance, or you can use it to create better crops to feed the starving. In other words, the answer is the answer, regardless of why you decided to seek the answer in the first place. Just as telling, however, is the fact that David mentions nothing of Copernicus's most influential detractors, famous theists who derived most of their arguments against Copernicus not from scientific methodology, but from Scripture. They included John Calvin, Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Nicholas Serarius, and Francesco Ingoli. So let's be clear. Even in the midst of the Protestant Reformation, there were influential Christians on both sides, united in their condemnation of Copernicus. The Catholic Church actively suppressed Copernicus's work, removed and altered passages of it because it was, quote, contrary to Holy Scripture, and they didn't want it to, quote, creep any further to the prejudice of Catholic truth. 400 years later, David Wood comes along on YouTube and says, we have Christianity to thank for Copernicus's discoveries. Yet when we look beyond the surface-level thinking, look beyond the snippet of a quote, and as we actually do the work and delve into the history, what we actually find is a great swath of influential Christians fighting tooth and nail against the very progress that Christians will eventually claim credit for after the truth of the matter becomes apparent. Christianity fights and fights and fights, and when it finally loses, it pretends the fight never took place and then plagiarizes the winner. If the findings of those scientists reaffirmed Christian truth, they would not have been so thoroughly persecuted from every corner of Christendom. The reason they were persecuted is because the implications of their scientific findings were contrary to Christian belief, at least until the apologists could figure out some mental gymnastics that would make them acceptable, a long-standing Christian tradition. I'm actually glad that they were there to find the loopholes that stopped Christians from suppressing science. In that regard, even we atheists owe those apologists our gratitude. The bulk of Christianity, however, believed that if those new ideas about the universe were accepted and disseminated, it would mean that their religion would lose influence. And they were right, because that is exactly what happened. Their fears were justified. The truth will out. Their brutal dominance was righteously sacrificed for a better, more prosperous, less authoritarian world. We need to do everything we can to maintain that direction. A surefire way to ruin our wonderful progress would be to indulge in a misguided Christian revival to combat Islam. Secularism is the answer to Islam. Both Christianity and Islam are ancient Middle Eastern Abrahamic religions. No matter how different they may seem to you, their DNA is identical, and their histories are both brutally oppressive. Either one is more than capable of throwing us all into limbo for 1,000 years. So let's not play with fire and figure out an intelligent and peaceful way to deal with Islam while preserving the freedoms and rights we have and striving to gain them for those who do not.